Sziasztok, köszöntöm a Partizán nézőit! David Szalay, a magyar származású író azokon a kérdéseken gondolkodik, hogy mit jelent a testünkbe zárt módon élni, testi tapasztalatokon keresztül érzékelni a valóságot. Miért nem vagyunk kapcsolatban a saját érzelmeinkkel, és inkább a férfiak problémája ez, vagy mindenkié? És mi köze ehhez a bevándorlásnak, a társadalmi mobilitásnak? Ezeket a kérdéseket vizsgálja angolul Flash, most már magyarul Test címmel is olvasható regényében David Szalay, amelynek főhőse egy István nevű pécsi származású fiú, aki egy szexuális abúzus történetén keresztül az iraki háborún át végül a londoni magas társadalmi rétegekbe való megérkezésig sok mindent megtapasztal, és ennek a férfinek a 10 éves korától a 60-as éveiig tartó élettörténete maga a regény. Úgyhogy ezekről a regény által felvetett kérdésekről beszélgetünk David Szalaival, itt a Nyitott Műhelyben, amelynek nagyon szépen köszönjük a befogadást, de mielőtt ezt még megtenném, szeretném kérni tőled, hogy mindenképpen csatlakozz a Partizán rendszeres támogatóihoz, hogyha szeretnéd, hogy például a művészet, a kultúra lencséjén keresztül is foglalkozhassunk különböző társadalmi kérdésekkel. Ugyanitt szeretném kérni azt is, hogy iratkozz fel a csatornánkra, ha még nem tetted volna meg, lehet, hogy te leszel éppen a 700 000. feliratkozó, közeledünk ehhez a kerekszámhoz, amit nagyon köszönünk mindenkinek, aki már csatlakozott hozzánk. Ezzel pedig fordulok tehát David Szalay Booker-díjas íróhoz. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Something really captured our attention when we were preparing for this interview, which is that you mentioned in an interview for the Booker Prizes a certain diary by Samuel Pepys, an old English politician whose diary is basically a really fascinating insight into his time, into the 17th century. But we became very curious what it was that really captured your attention about that particular book.
Great. I mean, that's not I didn't expect that to be the first question of the interview about Samuel Pepys, but I'm very happy to answer it. I love Samuel Pepys's diary. I mean, in English-speaking world, it's a very famous document. I mean, it's been continuously published in the centuries since he wrote it. I mean, I think he's an incredibly fascinating person because he has such a broad range of interests. He was, as you say, a significant sort of civil servant of the time. He was involved in the creation of the British Navy. But he loved music, literature, theatre, but he also just loved eating and drinking and hanging out in London in those days. And he gives this very detailed, very specific, very human account of his life in London at that time. And he seems incredibly he seems quite modern. You know, you can imagine almost, apart from, sort of a smartphone, he could almost be sort of a contemporary Londoner in terms of his sort of attitudes and the way he lives in a way. So I've always I've loved that book, and I've sort of go back to it very frequently. Yeah, I think another thing is that he happened to be writing during two very big sort of events that took place in London, the plague of 1665 and the Great Fire that destroyed the city in the following year. So his diaries provide first-hand accounts of these major events. So that's also interesting. And,
it was interesting to us that you were raising that particular book because the way it describes very physical bodily experiences as a way to get insight into his environment is a tool that you seem to
I mean, I think that there is in some way a connection between, I mean, I love Pepys's diary. I've as I was saying, I've been reading it, kind of looking at it, reading it again and dipping in. It's huge, so I mean, I have never sat down and read the whole thing from beginning to end. But I've been reading it for 30 years now. So yeah, of course, I imagine it's sort of. Well, one of the reasons I like it is because it provides a picture of life as a kind of totality. The physical, the intellectual, the emotional, all of these things. In a Pepys diary entry, you'll get all of these things in every day, So yes, I mean, in a way that was similar to what I was trying to do in Flesh as well.
And we are going to get back to Flesh in great detail later on, but I would also like to ask you about another interesting point you made in that same interview, which is something that involves discussing bad books with others and how that would be the ideal book club. You would participate in a book club about bad books. So what is it that a bad book and trying to understand and critique a bad book can teach us in a way that a good book can't?
I don't remember saying that, but I'm sure I did. I think, I mean, talking about bad books, yes. I mean, in a way, it's maybe it's not more instructive than talking about good books, but it's just as instructive, I guess, if you're trying to understand what makes a good book. Looking at bad books is a way of addressing that question as well, because you're looking at basically the ways in which these books failed, and from that you can learn about what might succeed. Yeah, I mean, it's just. I think what I said in that interview, if I remember, is it's more about having strong feelings either way. It's more if you love a book or if you hate a book, it's more interesting than if you just thought it was okay. So, and in a book club, you want. Ideally, in fact, I think what I said is you'd want some people who loved the book and some people who hated the book to have a debate about it, with some of them arguing on the positive side and some on the negative side. So if everyone agrees in a book club, then it's not as fun as if there are violent disagreements.
I was about to ask about those violent disagreements. Do you experience provoking those yourself sometimes?
I mean, I generally kind of avoid reviews, discussion. I don't particularly, I definitely don't seek out those kind of things about my own books. And even if they're sent to me, I often don't read them. I think it's better for me in every way not to know, about that. If it's bad, it can be upsetting. If it's good, it can also cause problems. If you can get complacent, you can get. So I avoid that. So I don't really know. But I know that when I was in Sweden last week, people kept saying that the book there had provoked a big debate, but they couldn't or wouldn't tell me what this debate was about exactly. So something to do with masculinity, maybe, or I don't know. There were various hints, but anyway, I'm very happy if the book does provoke some kind of debate. I mean, in the same way that a book club is more interesting if there are violent disagreements of opinion about the book. It's good if a book provokes discussion of any kind, really.
Yesterday, when we are recording this, it was yesterday that you opened the annual book festival, the Ünnepi Könyvhét, here in Budapest with a speech. Just generally, how was that experience for you?
I mean, it was great. It was I lived in Budapest for some years until about 3 years ago. And since then, I haven't been back to Budapest much. I go back to Pécs very frequently because that's where my Hungarian family mostly live. So I go to Pécs almost every month. But to Budapest, not so often. So to come back to Budapest, I arrived back just an hour or two before the thing. So it was all very kind of immediate and intense. So to come back to Budapest and suddenly find myself on the stage addressing a crowd, with kind of politicians and the mayor and stuff was quite intense, but it was great. I won't forget it.
Your speech basically, it was really interesting. It gave an account of your own connections to Hungary and why, despite that, you don't consider yourself to be, I think you said, a Hungarian writer in any simple sense.
Yeah.
So I listened to the speech actually, and I was wondering what exactly, to me as a reader, is the stake of the question of who is or isn't a Hungarian writer, what is and isn't a Hungarian book. So why did you think this was the central theme?
Well, I mean, I mean, mainly because my understanding is that I'm the first person to deliver this opening speech not in Hungarian.
Right.
That's what I was told. And, I'm both honored by that and slightly embarrassed by that I wasn't able to. But it did lead me to think, obviously the other people who have introduced it in the past, speaking in Hungarian, have been people who also write in Hungarian. And I think a Hungarian writer, as I said in the speech itself, writes in Hungarian. You know, ultimately that is what makes someone a, you know, straightforwardly Hungarian writer. I don't write in Hungarian, of course, so that means that I'm not a Hungarian writer in that important sense. And I guess that was the starting point from the other thoughts in the speech. That was what I began with, that feeling. Because obviously, yes, this book, Flesh, Test, has a Hungarian protagonist. Parts of it are set in Hungary. It's in many ways a very Hungarian book. And it is very closely connected to my own experiences over the years of Hungary. And so it occupies a sort of ambiguous zone. You know, is it a Hungarian book? Is it not a Hungarian book? That's very interesting, actually, that kind of grey zone that it occupies there. So that's what I kind of wanted to talk about, I think, in the speech yesterday.
You mentioned also that, yes, it was a peculiar moment in which to address a Hungarian crowd in between the Minister of Culture and the Mayor of Budapest. What did you make of the fact that you were here in Hungary at a certain moment when people were saying things like, well, we have not had a Minister of Culture on the stage in a generation, and so on?
Yes, sure. I mean, I was obviously, it was arranged that I would make this speech before the election. This commitment to make the speech was made several months ago. So I knew that there were two very distinct sets of circumstances in which I would be making the speech, depending on the election result. And, you know, it would have been far more difficult for me to make this speech had the election gone the other way. I think with the election going the way it did, in a way that meant that I felt able not to address any political issue at all in the speech. You know, I felt because of this great change that has taken place politically in Hungary in the last 2 months, there was no reason for me to talk about politics in the speech. Right. It sort of freed me. I felt freed. I think that if the election had gone the other way, it would have been necessary for me to say something about the political state of Hungary in the speech, which would have been quite difficult because it's something that I would have had to handle it very delicately, just because that's not a political forum. Those you know, I don't really see the Könyvhét as, it's nice if politics doesn't intrude too much into it, but had the election gone the other way, then it would have been impossible not to say something about the politics of the country, I think.
I can't resist asking, unfortunately. You like to share, you have shared in different interviews this story where you placed a bet on the Brexit referendum back in the day, actually on the outcome that you didn't desire, that you didn't hope would happen, but at least there was a consolation prize there. Did you consider placing a bet on the Hungarian election? No,
the stakes were simply too high.
Higher than Brexit?
Yeah, in a way, I think, yes. I mean, this election in Hungary, 2 months ago, I think it felt like the stake. I've never known an election where the stakes felt so high. Yes, even more than the Brexit vote, which was a very high stakes and a very, very significant vote for Britain and for Europe. But in this Hungarian election, for Hungary certainly, the stakes felt even higher than that. No, I didn't. I did. I sometimes do that. I had a bet on Trump to win the presidential election, the last one.
The last one.
You know, I mean, I like betting on political events, especially when I'm betting on the outcome that I don't personally want. But in this case, in the Hungarian election, it felt the stakes were too high. I didn't. It didn't occur to me even to place a bet on it.
Interesting that you felt higher stakes with regard to Hungary than even these geopolitical events. Of course, you have much more connection to Hungary than to other Eastern European countries, and you have talked about how you have met other Hungarians, young Hungarians, who have spent maybe some time in the West, and even in the case of your previous book, All That Man Is, you were interested in the fact that many people in Europe are basically constantly on the move. What were these experiences that captured your attention so much that it became the center of your new novel, Flesh?
Well, I mean, I think, yes, Flesh, like All That Man Is, it's a story about movement within Europe. But the main difference, of course, is that it focuses on a single character in this case, whereas All That Man Is focused on multiple characters. Yeah, I mean, it's something that has interested me for at least 10 years and more. But the way that this is sort of reshaping Europe in quite a profound sense, the movement of people. I mean, there's been a great movement of people from east to west in the last 20 years. I mean, we're talking millions, maybe even tens of millions of people. You know, that's a big thing. I mean, because not only those people move, then very often those people will, for instance, have a relationship with someone in the Western Europe, have children with them, family connections will be formed, a kind of lattice of connections is formed across Europe that slightly changes the whole feel of the continent or the nature of it somehow. I think there must be more people who have family connections to more than one European country now than ever before. This is a big thing. And I wanted to write about it in 2016 with All That Man Is, and I still wanted to write about it with Flesh. But in Flesh, it's more focused on two specific countries, Hungary and Britain, England. And I particularly wanted to write about those countries because those are the two countries in Europe that I personally know the best.
You have also told 1749 last year that your own view of Eastern Europe had also changed significantly over these years, maybe even since All That Man Is. But that you also remember what it used to be like to see Eastern Europe from a foreigner's perspective in these terms of a vague and mysterious land, something that is different, and of course there is this idea of backwardness around it. So what do you think is the reason that these perspectives, these notions are still so prevalent?
Well, I mean, I think that my dominant memories as a child of coming to Hungary are of the main thing which I knew as a child is that Hungary was part of this communist Eastern world, which was very separate, of course, from Western Europe at the time, and that was very visible. That was something that was very palpable. That made a great impression on me, I think. And so until the 1990s, that was my dominant impression of it. But of course, since then, the picture's become much more complicated. There is still, Hungary and the other countries that were part of that Eastern world, are still experiencing the consequences of that, and are still working it through, and are still, in a process of development away from that. But of course, it's a dynamic thing. I mean, the idea that the West is changing too. I mean, the whole thing is in flux. It's not just a simple picture of this and then these countries and these countries kind of becoming more like these countries. It's not like the initial picture was you had Western Europe and you had, in 1989, the former communist countries of Eastern Europe, and the idea was that they would in time become more like Western Europe until maybe they'd become indistinguishable in some way from Western Europe. But actually it's much more complicated than
Never happened like that.
But no, it doesn't happen like that, because everybody's changing all the time. The West is changing as well. The world is so dynamic, so it's a much more complicated and in a way interesting picture than that. I think that, that there has, compared to the gap that existed in my childhood, there isn't such a big gap now. I mean, Hungary is more like Western Europe than it was before 1989. I mean, it just is. It's a very complicated picture. I mean, which is, in a way, why it's interesting to write novels that have this as a consideration, because it's the kind of thing which a novel is able to approach, because novels are good with very complicated, nuanced situations.
Yeah, but when you discuss Eastern Europe, either in Britain or in other places where there is maybe a curiosity about your exotic Hungarian roots or something like that, do you think that there are misconceptions in that curiosity or in the way that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think there probably are. Yes. Yes, yes, of course there are. I mean, there are misconceptions. There are misconceptions the other way too, of course. I think when Hungarians think of, for example, England, I'm sure what they think of if they haven't spent time there isn't quite the reality of the place either. So there are always these misconceptions. But and also, I guess that the idea of a place as viewed from outside, I guess, always tends to lag the reality by time. The idea is always the idea of the place in the recent past. So I think that, Western European views of Eastern Europe are they're still conditioned by the sort of communist Cold War era to some extent, I think. Although that is fading away, and a new relationship is kind of coming into being. And as I say, it's very significant that in England, for example, there are several million people from Poland, Hungary, Romania, etc. And that's very significant. That when I was growing up, there were hardly any Hungarians in London. It was very unusual to be a Hungarian in London. Probably the small number of Hungarians in London mostly were people who had arrived, or their parents had arrived in 1956. So it was this very small community that had a sort of special status as refugees from communism, and didn't really loom large in the imagination of the country as a whole. Whereas more recently, in the last 20 years, because of this very great migration from Eastern Europe that's taken place, Hungary and other countries in this region seem less exotic, I think, than they once did. This idea, I don't think it is very exotic anymore to have roots in the eastern half of Europe, because it's so common now in England to meet people who have that.
I guess what I'm most curious about regarding the conceptions of Eastern Europe is what do people in general, or maybe you specifically, think is a more useful way to try to talk about Hungary or the region as a sort of place that is on the same trajectory as Western European countries, just a little bit backwards, or in this process of catching up, or because more remote regions of the world are not measured by that.
No, I know.
At all. And
I know.
Yes.
Yeah. No, this catching up dynamic. I mean, I think the catching up dynamic probably is bigger. I mean, that idea is bigger in the minds of people here than in the minds of people. Although, I mean, there are people, for instance, in England now, that people are getting very agitated about the idea that Poland might have a higher GDP per capita than England in 2040 or something, So this idea that the catching up is viewed in a slightly different way in a place like England. The catching up, if somewhere like Poland succeeds in supposedly catching up with, say, England, in England that would be regarded as a kind of failure on their part to sort of, Poland has caught up with us, therefore we've done something wrong. So the dynamic looks different from the other side. I mean, I think that this kind of obsession with catching up, with convergence, I'm not sure how useful it is. Clearly Hungary is poorer than Austria, for instance. I mean, that's undeniable, and it would be nice if Hungary was as wealthy as Austria, for instance. We can all agree on that. But it's something that would be a good outcome, and whatever steps might be taken economically and politically to help that happen would be good. But as a kind of overriding dynamic, I don't know. I think it's not necessarily a very healthy thing to become too obsessed with, but it's there because the societies are otherwise so similar. You know, I mean, Vienna and Budapest are so similar in so many ways that it's obvious to kind of be drawn to that comparison and that idea of looking at the difference and being focused on that. And also, you know, there's the sense of the damage of the communist decades, and that's a kind of harm that has to be undone, which is in a way true. I don't know. I mean, I'm in a way I'm an outsider to this debate too. I mean, I.
But earlier this year, you also discussed with HVG this, to me, really interesting notion of possibly being ashamed or feeling ashamed to talk about Hungarian heritage. I have lived in Germany and Austria for 6 years in total, and I have had this experience of people feeling sorry when they heard I was Hungarian, and I was like, sure, we have our views about the government, but you don't have to feel sorry about the fact that I'm Hungarian. And you also don't have to make assumptions about what my political views are and how maybe they are not as progressive as yours, because that's not how it goes. But this is why it was very interesting for me that you've discussed this idea of almost feeling ashamed of Hungarian heritage, and I really wonder if that was your own feeling or your own thought, or if people were implying that you should.
No, I mean, what I would say is that, I mean, it's wrong to say that I was ashamed of my Hungarian heritage is wrong. I mean, that's not what I said, because it was nothing to do with my Hungarian heritage, actually. I would never be ashamed of my Hungarian heritage, and that's not what I said. What I did say is that it had become embarrassing to be connected to Hungary in any way, in fact, because of the political situation that prevailed at the time. I mean, you know, Hungary was generally, I mean, particularly among the kind of people who I encountered in my life in England or Germany or wherever in Western Europe, these were people who, in, you know, fields like publishing and the arts and, you know, my old friends and stuff, these were people who pretty unanimously disapproved of the previous Hungarian government, and of course the media coverage of Hungary through all those years in Western Europe was generally very negative. And I think, you know, there's a very important distinction to make, because the previous government, the Fidesz government themselves, liked to say that this was all because of, you know, gender issues and immigrants and whatever. But it's not, and of course that did come up, but it was really the dominant thing was actually more the sense that Hungarian democracy was shriveling, was dying, and that Hungary was being sucked closer and closer to Russia. You know, it was these things which were the dominant concerns, and rightly so, because those were problems, and I was embarrassed about that. You know, I mean, I've made me feel very sad. Basically, it didn't make me feel positive when talking about Hungary with people in England, say, or Austria, or wherever. I was sad about what was happening in Hungary at that time. I was worried, and the people that I was talking to had often, through their own media, information about it that made it sound actually even worse than it actually was. Mm-hmm. So I often found myself in a position of kind of saying, well, actually, no, it's not that bad. You know, Hungary isn't literally a dictatorship, you know, but then you start to sound as if you're defending Fidesz.
Yes.
If you're arguing that, if you're telling people in England kind of, well, no, Hungary is not a dictatorship, they'll kind of think, well, are you defending Orbán? It was that awkwardness and embarrassment. It wasn't, shame is the wrong word. I never really felt shame about it, but there were negative feelings. It was hard to be straightforwardly positive, feel positive about a connection to Hungary in those years.
Yes, I agree. Awkwardness is the right way to put this. But this was your own view, regardless of how. So it's not that others made you feel particularly or intensify.
No. I mean, no. The issue was that my own feelings about Hungary were the political situation in Hungary were feelings of concern, worry, unhappiness, and. But you know how it is. If someone criticizes your family, you kind of defend your family, even if even if you agree with their criticism. You know what I mean? So there was, I guess, very much that dynamic. So if I'd encounter people who were kind of saying really terrible, no, Hungary's just this horrible dictatorship, it should be thrown out of the EU. I mean, you'd hear that kind of talk in for instance, Germany and Austria in recent years, and. It was painful to hear that. Yeah. And I would try and defend Hungary sometimes, I mean, of course, say, Hungary's not a dictatorship actually, and maybe things will get better. But then, as I say, you kind of find yourself, it was just not a very happy situation for anyone to be in, I don't think. Yeah.
I remember when the head of the EU Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, slapped Mr. Orbán in the face and said, "Hello, dictator," or something like that. And without thinking anything positive about Orbán, it still felt like an embarrassing moment for me. It was still my prime minister who got slapped in the face.
Who was being humiliated in public. Yes, of course. It wasn't good.
I'm asking about this complicated awkwardness, or I was asking about this because in the case of Flesh, this cultural alienation is also a key theme, the difficulty of growing up somewhere and belonging there or not. Not in this directly political way, for sure, but in a different way. The story is about a Hungarian boy who proceeds to serve as a soldier in Iraq for a while and then makes a life for himself in London as an Eastern European immigrant. So to what extent does the experience of quote-unquote not belonging anywhere define this story to you?
Well, I mean, it was one of the kind of original sources of this story in my kind of imagination, if you like. At the time I started writing it, I had been living in Hungary for a few years already, and so I sort of started to lose touch with London. I'd started to feel that I was no longer someone who had an intimate day-to-day connection with London, of course. At the same time, I will always be, to some extent, a foreigner in Hungary, but my kind of inability to speak the language very well is perhaps the main reason for that, but whatever the reason, that's the case, I think. So I myself felt a bit sort of divided or torn between these two places, and I wanted to write a book that somehow addressed that feeling or involved that feeling, or at the very least was partly set in Hungary and partly set in England. So yes, that personal feeling was important in the very initial conception of the book, I think. Yeah,
it's a book about this man called István, who is as I said, he grows up in Hungary. He ultimately makes a life for himself as an immigrant in England, and this idea of being attached to multiple places, but also having really complicated relationships to multiple places, it presents itself as a problem in finding a sense of self. Do you think it's maybe not so much just for you, but for István? Do you find that it is simply a complication and a problem for him to solve, or also something that he gains from and that can be a resource?
I think it's certainly something that has positive aspects. I mean, I in my own personal case, I've kind of made my peace with this. I don't, so I don't really experience this as a problem or a burden. I've accepted that this is the nature of my life, and that's fine. I mean, I don't have a problem with it. And I think István comes to us a similar point in the end as well. I should stress that István's life and my life bear almost no resemblance to each other in terms of the actual events that take place. But yes, I mean and of course he's in our situations, even in the sense of our situations with the countries in question. That's very different too. But Yeah, I mean, I think as I say, I don't experience it as a sort of problem in any way. And for me as a writer, I think it can be a positive thing. It can certainly have positive effects because of just the sort of the heightened observation that you have in places that have a kind of edge of unfamiliarity to them. I remember this is almost like a metaphor for what I'm talking about. I remember when I was a child and came to Hungary, I would sit in rooms with my father and his Hungarian family, and there'd be a lot of talk in Hungarian, which I couldn't really understand. But that meant that I had to focus on other aspects of people's behavior and communication, like intonation of voice or gesture or where their eyes would. I mean, so basically what I'm saying is not being able to understand the language meant that I became much more attuned to other forms of behavior and communication. And that's kind of like a metaphor for what I'm talking about, that if you're in a situation of unfamiliarity, you will see things that people who are totally familiar with the situation will not see.
A big part of the reception of this novel highlights how much of a drifting character István is, somebody who rarely really makes his own decisions. Part of the reception was also likening the book to the prose of Albert Camus because of this drifting, and I'm not sure if that's a comparison you would wholeheartedly embrace. But what I'm curious about is he experiences this sexual relationship that can very much be read as abuse. He ends up in a reform school. He becomes a soldier in Iraq. He becomes an immigrant, and it's always as if these were never really his decisions, or he's never in a position where he has a strong preference seemingly for what should happen. So, I mean, first of all, do you agree with this characterization, and why is it important in István's character and in this story that he drifts rather than acts?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think István's kind of passivity can be exaggerated. I feel it sometimes is exaggerated. So I think he does display agency. I mean, for instance, it must be his decision to go to London. That's not the fact that the decision falls between two chapters of the book and we don't see him make the decision de-emphasizes the agency, I guess, but nevertheless it must be his decision and his agency to do that. And at various other points in the book too. I mean, István shows very definite agency. Often it takes the form of physical action. Often it is not premeditated or reflected on, but in a way that doesn't disqualify it from being agency. So yes, I think that can be exaggerated. Having said all that, the book is, I think, partly about the way that everybody's life is shaped by things they can't control, forces outside of themselves, random events. So yes, there is a sense that the book is about this question of agency and free will, and to what extent free will and agency exist, and to what extent they define our lives. And I mean, my own answer would be that they define our lives maybe less than we often think they do. And, it was interesting when you kind of listed the István's, the sort of major events of István's life. I mean, yes, I mean, because of who he is in social terms at the beginning, his choices are limited, for someone with limited education, like he ends up with, obviously because of what happens, and he goes to sort of juvenile prison. I mean, his education is kind of ruined. Their choices are limited, so something like the army, or then going to England and working as a sort of bouncer and security guard. He didn't have that many other choices. The idea that everyone has a kind of huge range of choices that they can sort of pick from isn't quite right either.
Another big factor that always shapes István's life, and this is also something the reception highlighted, is physical encounters of different kinds. So do you think it is us in general, people in general, who don't even realize how much physical encounters and bodily experiences shape our life? Or is it maybe men in general, or maybe drifting characters in general, or maybe people who have this complicated relationship to belonging, or who is it? Is it all people, or is it people like István?
I would say it's everybody. I mean, I see. I don't really see István as I see István as a kind of fairly normal guy. Basically, I don't see István as some sort of very unusual person. So, you know, the things we're talking about, I see, you know, they apply in my mind. You know, they apply pretty much to everybody, and the physicality as well. I mean, I think, you know, there are two aspects to why this sort of the physicality of our lives is something that we don't often pay that much attention to. One is that we take it so for granted, you know, the fact that we're physical bodies, and pretty much everything about our lives flows from that, you know, what we want, what we don't want, what we like, what we don't like, what we seek. All of that is intimately connected with physicality ultimately. But we take that so for granted that we almost don't think about it. And I think that's part of the reason why in the novel, particularly in novels, it's even more de-emphasized, you know, and novels often sort of conceive of their characters as psychologies, you know, as minds, to quite a large extent. And in this book, I really wanted to conceive of the characters, first of all, as bodies, but, you know, that's not to say they don't have psychologies. It's not to say they don't have minds. It's not a choice of one or the other. It both exist, obviously. And in fact, as I was saying before, and when we were talking about Samuel Pepys, I kind of see them as forming a unity. In fact, they're not really that easy to separate from each other, kind of the physical and the emotional, the intellectual, to do with the mind, to do with the body. It's an artificial distinction to separate them, and what's so wonderful about Pepys is that he doesn't, and in his writing and his account of his own life, those things are all kind of mashed together. And in Flesh, in Test, I was I guess trying to also produce a picture of existence that didn't have a sharp divide between the mind and the body.
And also these experiences that really have to do with the physical body are sometimes shaping István's life in really negative ways, or they basically they create problems for him, or he experiences maybe even the fact that he has to do something with his body as a problem. But in other moments, it also presents itself as an opportunity, like when he ultimately finds his way into higher society in London. It is because of basically being an object of desire in some way. Yeah. So what do you think we should see in István's life being shaped by physical experiences? Is that a limitation? Is that an opportunity? Is that both?
Well, it's both, and it's just a fact that has to be accepted, you know, and it's not just István, as I say. I mean, I think this applies to everybody. So, I mean, obviously being a body is limiting, you know, I mean, but it also, since that's what we are, there are positive things about it too. So, and as you say, István, all of the major kind of narrative moments in the book are to do with something very physical, sort of sex or desire or violence and anger, you know, and these things define all of the kind of main moments where the narrative has goes one way or another. And that's not an accident, of course. I mean, that's to do with this idea that the book wanting to be about the physicality of experience. And so it's just, I think, again, that's something that is sort of under considered, if you like, the idea that our lives are just so defined by that physicality. And so to think of our lives as being a process by which we kind of come to rational decisions about things, and that's the important thing. I don't think that's really a true picture at all. I think that it's what drives decisions is much more a kind of ultimately physical thing, and often the sort of the sense of rational decision making is something that we project back in retrospect to justify what happened or what we chose.
Which is perhaps why these scenes, these key moments are and have to be described in really explicit and graphic ways.
Yes, of course. No, I mean, exactly. I mean, that's necessary. I mean, the sort of the sexual encounters in the book and the moments of violence also, you know, they're integral to the plot. They are the plot. You know, they are the main thing there. So it was very important to describe them very specifically.
It's interesting you mentioned aggression and violence as part of these physical encounters along with sexuality, because indeed these two, sometimes they seem intertwined.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. No, exactly. I mean, I wouldn't make a sharp distinction there either, yeah. It's
related to an observation made by Hungarian poet and literary critic Emese Bodor, which she pointed out in a podcast that in the way István interprets sexuality, there is very often a certain aggression to that, and sometimes or very often he's maybe angry with the partners with whom he has those sexual relations. So it's as if sex is always tied to power dynamics.
Not always. I mean, I think that the various different sort of sexual encounters and relationships in the book are all different and specific. I mean, I hope that was what I was trying to do. So, you know, especially in the first half of the book, there's a lot of, you know, there are power dynamics. In the first chapter, it's a very clear power dynamic, and it's being abused. The power dynamic is being abused. I mean, by the neighbor character, and that constitutes a kind of abuse, and it's, you know, that's morally, ethically very problematic. And of course, when he first starts the relationship with Helen in London, that there's a very definite power dynamic there that's to do with sort of money and social power, social status. But I think later the relationship with Helen turns into something quite different, and so it develops. But I think that's also reflects reality. I mean, things do develop, things change all the time. I think that the brief affair he has with Mrs. Szymanski later in the book is the most obvious example of anger and sex kind of fusing into almost the same thing, or one being an expression of the other. So it's all different. It's all specific. I wouldn't want to. There are no generalities really, or it's dangerous to make sweeping generalizations about these things, because I tried very carefully in the book to give each thing its own specific quality.
You have also said, speaking of the language of this book, that you didn't want a character who over-explains himself, and the narration is in this way similar to István himself in the book. The book itself doesn't over-explain itself, and to hear more about your thoughts on what's wrong with over-explaining ourselves.
Well, I mean, in principle, nothing. But in the case of this book, it's really, I guess, to keep the focus on the physicality. You know, if you decide that you want to present your characters first of all as bodies, and only kind of after that, if you like, as minds and psychologies, then a character who explains themselves verbally to the reader will ruin that idea, because that character will become a mind, a psychology, a verbal construct in the reader's imagination. It takes the focus away from the physicality. That was, for me, the issue there. That was why, for this book, where I wanted the physicality to be so prominent, it was important to have as a protagonist someone like István who wouldn't pull it the other way by constantly talking about his thoughts. He does have thoughts. I feel sure of that, but we're not always party to them, and his physicality is at least as prominent.
I'm asking this because the idea of being a person who is in touch with his emotions, who always has a really rational sense or an ability to rationalize what he or she feels and why, that's probably an ideal that is sometimes held up or something that is depicted as how we should all be, and novels do also speak in those terms about their characters sometimes. So do you think that when we hold that up as the only way to be maybe mature or the only way to have a healthy relationship to emotions, do you think that idea misses something?
Look, I'm broadly would agree with it. A kind of, I think maybe we can say just self-awareness is good,
right?
to be aware of first of all the effects you have on other people, to be aware of the feelings that other people provoke in you, to have some idea of why that might be the case. You know, all of these are obviously good things, and will probably make you a happier person and also a nicer person to be with. So that's all good. But I think that it is also a bit more complicated than that. What we feel about things isn't that there isn't a kind of it's not something that exists like a sort of object that we can be aware of. It's much more vague and ambiguous and changing and you know, cloudy than that. So I think it can be exaggerated the extent to which we can know those things. And I think if we construct rational verbal pictures of that, then we can also become kind of the prisoner of those pictures, those ideas. You know, those ideas, you know, if we have an account of ourselves, we have to be careful not to put our total faith in that and not to treat that as kind of absolute truth either. You know, that, I guess that's what I would say about it. And it's so it's not like that it's not like a problem to which there is a solution. It's much more complicated, ongoing. It's a process that never ends, you know. So yes, I mean, I would broadly agree with the positive idea of how we should sort of think and have self-awareness and relate to other people in the light of that self-awareness. But you know, in practice, it's extremely complicated, and it's not like there's a solution to a problem. That's not the correct. I don't really see that's not how it is.
Your Hungarian translator András Barabás also highlighted this aspect to telex, that establishing and maintaining physical relationships seems much easier in flesh. Maybe not even just for István, but in the world of that novel, it seems easier than forming emotional bonds. And we've talked about how István's own emotional world is kind of inaccessible to him. And some people have read that as being related primarily to being a man, and this being a commentary on how men don't have the tools or aren't given the tools to deal with their emotions. But is that something that can also be overemphasized, or is it primarily to you related to being a man?
Well, I mean, I think it can be overemphasized, but maybe there's a specifically male aspect to it as well. But I mean, I'd say I'd slightly take issue with this idea of the tools. I mean, that, in a way, that's a very male image, isn't it? You get given the tools, and then everything's fine. You can once you have these tools, you can everything. It's not really like that. I mean, it's not a question of being given tools and then everything's okay. It's a question of an ongoing process of self-awareness that has a sort of has to be dynamic, because you're changing and everything is always changing. So if you have a sort of static picture of things, then it will very quickly become obsolete. Anyway, I can't really remember what the specific question was, but I think István does form emotional bonds in the book. I think that's also important. You know, I think that he and Helen, by the end, have a pretty strong emotional bond. I think he has a very strong emotional bond with his son. I think he has a strong emotional bond with his mother. I think, you know, it's not that István, I really want to emphasize that, and this is where we maybe depart from the world of Camus, as he was saying. People have brought that up, but István is not really like a hero in you know, the Outsider or a Camus novel like that, because he does form meaningful emotional bonds, and you know, I think, and that's very much part of his world. The fact that he doesn't, you know, it comes back to the idea of sort of verbalization. The fact that he doesn't tell the reader, I've formed these emotional bonds. You know, do the emotional bonds exist if you don't sort of say out loud that they exist? Of course they do. You know, I mean, the emotional bonds don't rely on being spoken aloud. They exist anyway. And I think the book is an attempt to describe and portray the kind of emotional bonds that exist without being verbalized to a very significant degree. Yeah. So I mean, I think that any sort of account of the book that sort of portrays István as simply being emotionally blank or stunted or deformed, I don't really agree with that. I think it's more complicated than that.
And it is much more that he doesn't verbalize or easily articulate these. But I'd like to stay a little bit on the topic of masculinity. And something that was really also interesting to us to observe in the book is that in several instances what it means for him to be a man, what as a sign of masculinity is defined externally by others to him. He is told, you are a man now after that first sexual encounter, or there is this initiation ritual by drinking and smoking. At another point there is the observable male image of the London elite that he is expected to participate in, and basically that means as he moves between different social strata, he is also moving between different male images.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think so.
Do you think he notices that?
He certainly has an instinct for it, because you know he does in fact sort of prosper in the world of the London rich for a time anyway. You know, he manages to make himself part of that in a sort of viable way, and it's absolutely right to point out that there are these different ideas of masculinity in different contexts in the book. So yes, it is something that's in the book. I don't think it's the main subject of the book. For me, masculinity is not the thing that this book is about, but it's definitely there. And that's an important part of it. The different conceptions of masculinity in different contexts, whether it be when he's in the army in Hungary or whether he's among very rich people in England. There are different codes of masculinity. Masculinity is expressed through different signs.
Were you surprised by how much of the reception to your book did try to read it as a commentary on masculinity?
No, I wasn't surprised. I mean, I was slightly disappointed, but I wasn't entirely surprised. I wasn't really disappointed either. I mean, people can talk about it. I'm happy if people talk about the book at all. But I thought it might be. And in fact, there were the word masculinity only appears once in the final book. And there were a few other instances of the word itself appearing, which I removed in order to try and dissuade people from thinking about it too much in terms of masculinity. But, and to be fair, also many of the reviews of the book, in English anyway, have specifically made the point, this is not a book that's only about masculinity. So, you know, it's not like the book has been received just as a sort of treatise on masculinity, which is good. There has been a lot of talk about it, but that's fine too.
There are indeed other key aspects, even just considering the different social aspects that you raise questions about, or that you portray in some ways. It's not just masculinity; it's also social mobility, if you will, the way you infiltrate different classes and you infiltrate a higher social class. It occurred to us that it also feels like a sometimes even aggressive act or something that is also characterized by desire and the desire for domination, if you allow me that word, to penetrate something that you didn't previously have access to, even somehow analogous to the physical encounters that we sometimes see.
Yes. I mean, well, I would say so for sure, and that was, that was part of my thought when I was writing the book. Yes, I mean, I think the physicality is important. Why write a book that has this emphasis on physicality? Because I believe it's very important to sort of understand how central that is to our existence as a whole, And so I would say that even our kind of social structures and relationships have their root in certain in physicality, and specifically in certain sort of physical sort of instincts and desires. So yes, what you were saying, I would absolutely agree with, and the sort of there is no sort of sharp divide between sort of sexual desire and the desire to kind of be of a higher social status, which everybody is animated by to some extent. Those two things are related somehow, I'm sure.
I would like to ask, as a final topic, a little bit more about this language that has been described as simple or plain or undecorated or ornamented. Maybe it occurred to us, you mentioned László Krasznahorkai in your speech at the Ünnepi Könyvhét as the Hungarian writer who won a Nobel Prize, and yet it was you. My point is that indeed there are two writers with Hungarian connections who won prestigious prizes in the past year. So the comparison sort of invites or readily offers itself. And in the case of Krasznahorkai, it seems like the award partly recognized precisely the fact that his language puts readers into some kind of this meditative state with those never-ending sentences, and his style of writing does require intense focus, and he does make that choice that he is expecting that of his reader, which stands in contrast to not just to your prose, but generally to the so-called attention crisis, the decreasing attention span we often have, and so this seems to have influenced the minimalist language of your book.
Yeah, I mean, yes, maybe. I mean, the language, the main motivations behind this style of this book, were not. I didn't say I need to write a book which addresses people's tiny attention spans. If it does, that's as a side effect, that's great. But the style of the book was more driven by. It's a matter of characterization. The style reflects the character. Is part of the creation of the character. Partly the style is to sort of heighten the emotional impact of what happens in the book. I think that the simple, restrained, slightly detached style actually means that when things of emotional impact happen, they can kind of hit harder, maybe, than in a if they were written sort of with a more obvious attempt to sort of create emotion and impact. So those were the main reasons behind the choice of style for the book. But yes, I mean, it's true that the book reads very easily. It's very kind of transparent in a way. It's the sentences are mostly very short. The vocabulary is mostly quite a sort of narrow selection of vocabulary. So yes, it's easy to read, but I don't see that as a problem. I see that as a good thing, if anything.
No, definitely not. Definitely not a problem. It just
yes, but it's true. I mean, it's so what you say is completely valid. The the contrast with Krasznahorkai stylistically is huge. Yes.
And it just raised this question in me about also how you have spoken about how a writer must, maybe because you were asked about the same topic, and you do take into account that readers are capable of paying attention in different ways. So while we have discussed that the language of the book is part of the characterization of the main character, and actually the narrator sounds a bit like István himself,
yes,
and that is the main factor here. But I'm curious, what do you think is the role that literature might play in the attention crisis? How much it has to adapt, or how much it has to actually decidedly resist?
I don't think it can kind of resist. I mean, I think that literature, by which I just mean written novels, basically, we're talking about here, I think it has to sort of follow, it's a product of society. It's a product of the culture. So as the culture changes, it has to change. As the language changes, it has to change. It must, I think if it doesn't grow organically and sort of out of the culture which exists generally, then it will not be a living thing anymore. I think it has to have a living and organic relationship with both the culture and the language, the specific spoken language of that culture. So I think it's not a question of, but I think that happens very naturally. That happens just because the writers themselves are part of that culture. I think the important thing in a way is not to be too self-conscious about it. I think that to sort of self-consciously say I must resist something is not necessarily a very healthy attitude to start with. And by the way, nor is it a good attitude to kind of think I must write something which is about the culture as it is today, right now, and to be very self-conscious about kind of being as sort of zeitgeisty as possible. I think if you write without too much self-consciousness in either direction, that's probably the best way of approaching it.
David Szalay, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate the opportunity.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ez volt tehát a beszélgetésünk David Szalay Booker-díjas íróval, a Test című regény szerzőjével. Nagyon szépen köszönjük, hogyha támogatod a Partizán munkáját, akár rendszeres támogatóként, és azt is, hogyha feliratkozol a csatornánkra, illetve még egyszer szeretném megköszönni, hogy itt a Nyitott Műhelyben, könyvek között, ebben a nagyon barátságos környezetben tudtuk megvalósítani ezt a beszélgetést. Munkatársaim nevében is nagyon köszönöm a figyelmeteket. Sziasztok!